Hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Hey, boy, sorry, I put 7 o'clock and I was thinking 7:30. So sorry. Um, don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry about that. My bad. So anyway, moving on. So we are in the book of Revelation, not Revelation. Hold on. We're in the book of Leviticus. There we go. I'll get this figured out. So we're in Leviticus, and we are, of course, having some great stuff in here in Leviticus 19. Again, I do apologize for my tardiness. No good excuse for that. Well, here we are. So Leviticus 19, this chapter is so cool because it's about love, right? It's about love, right? That's what this one is all about, is love. Now, this is one of these areas where we often hear that, the God of the Old Testament was kind of a meanie. He was a bit of an authoritarian, definitely into law, and all those things in the first 5 books. Well, those don't really pertain to us too much, and then the New Testament comes along, and here comes Jesus, and now God's turned over a new leaf, and he's really into love, and he's not into Torah and law and all that kind of stuff. But yet this chapter is the chapter that talks about loving your neighbor as yourself, right? So when Jesus was asked, what are the 2 greatest commandments? He immediately said the Shema, right? He said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. That's a big one. And then he said, and the second is like it, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's found right here, smack dab in the middle of Leviticus 19. All right. So that is a seriously big deal. And we cannot overlook that because this is crazy important. All right. So let's jump in as we're going to get going here. Let me just get my water. Got my tea. I'm ready to go. All right. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. All right. Wow. So we start off, God is saying, look, I'm holy. I am set apart. You need to be set apart. Right. And that makes sense, right? If God is our king, if he's the one that we serve, then we want to be like him. And if we claim to be his subjects, then we need to be like him. Now, he doesn't just leave this up in the ether. It's really hard to understand what he's trying to say. No, he gives us very specific examples of what we're supposed to do. And it's interesting that he starts off, you shall revere his mother and his father. It's interesting that's not his father and his mother, but it actually starts with his mother, right? Because in God's economy, women have a huge role to play. Remember, God made man in his image, male and female, he made them, right? So we know man came first, and yet here he's telling us to revere his mother and his father, which is kind of flipping the whole idea there because, again, God made them equal. They're absolutely equal. All right, so that obviously is the 5th commandment. And then he says, keep my Sabbaths. Now that's interesting because it's not only the weekly Sabbath, which happens Friday night to Saturday night, but this is all of those special days where you're supposed to take a day off, right? Which is a great thing. And keep these, right? And why? Because I am the Lord your God. That should be enough, right? He shouldn't have to say any more. But again, people often question, well, do I really have to do that? Hey, God said to do it. That should be enough for us. Now, there's all these other benefits, like you get a day off. That's a big one. It's good for your health. And, God wants you to take that day off so you can spend time with him, right? So there's lots of extra reasons you should do it, but it should be good enough that God said, don't do that. All right, then he says, do not turn to idols, nor make for yourselves molded gods. I am the Lord your God. Again, if you're serving God, if your love is for him, then how can you have love for these other false gods? Now, they're real in the sense that there are entities behind these gods, but they're not anything like the one true God. Now, it's interesting here in the Hebrew. The word here is ha'elelim, right? I talk about this at length in Corrupting Image Volume 2, where this word elil is related to the Akkadian Elil, which comes from the Sumerian Enlil, and Enlil, we know, is Satan, which we find in Isaiah 14, verse 12, where it talks about Halel. All right, so those are all variations on that same theme. All right, so Elilim is something that's worthless, right? And of course, these gods are worthless, right? That's how the Bible interprets this. But this word in Sumerian means Lord Wind, could be God of gods. That's one way that they might have interpreted it. But this is the false god, right? God is telling us, don't go after the false gods, which are all modeled after Satan himself. Again, you can check that out in Corrupting the Image Volume 2 if you want to get, dig deep into the details of that. But this word, God's saying, look, it's me. Stick with me. Don't go after those false and worthless things. They have a shiny exterior. They look good for a while, but they will fail you and leave you just broken because they will not provide. They will not give you what you really desire. God is the one who gives you what you really desire. So don't go after these. And he says, and if you offer a sacrifice of a peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it of your own free will. Well, that's why it's called a peace offering, because this is no obligation. This is something you're just like, I am so in love with you, Lord. I bought you flowers, right? Or I'm so in love with you. I got you a special gift, right? So if you want to do that in these days, you would bring God a special peace offering. And he's telling you how that is supposed to be done. Now, we don't give sacrifices anymore because we have the one high priest, Yeshua, right? With his own blood, he took his own blood into the Holy of Holies, not of this creation, right? Not in this world. And he took his own blood and he offered there. So we are not required to bring any kind of an animal sacrifice in these days, because Yeshua did all that. But we can still give a peace offering, right? So if you want to, well, you can give money. That's one way you can certainly do that. You can give your time. You can give your talents. And it doesn't have to be only at church once a week. It can be in your community. It can be to big brothers and big sisters. You can give to Compassion International. Whatever you want to do, you find a way to give of yourself as a sacrifice of a peace offering. And that'll be something that is a sweet aroma in God's nostrils. He really does dig that. Okay. Now, in the case of it being actually an animal that's being slaughtered, he says, it shall be eaten the same day you offer it, and on the next day. So you got 2 days to eat this thing. Remember, they did not have refrigeration, and they're not going to salt this thing, so it's not going to last. So by the third day, guess what? Yeah, it's starting to get kind of nasty, right? Without a refrigerator, even when you have a refrigerator, how long can you leave, raw meat in your fridge? Well, maybe a week, depending on what it is. But after that, it starts going kind of bad, right? So without refrigeration, you've got basically 2 days. And on the third day, that's it. It's got to be gone. And you cannot eat it on the third day. It's got to be burned in the fire. He says, if it is eaten at all on the third day, it is an abomination, it will not be accepted. Therefore, everyone who eats it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned and hallowed the offering of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from his people. So you're bringing this thing of your own free will. You want to give this to God because you're so in love with him. And then if you don't follow the instructions that God says, the Lord, well, that didn't do you any good, right? So you got to follow the instruction. And really, God is doing this for your own good. He's telling you, trust me, you're going to appreciate that I'm doing this, okay? And I'm giving you this commandment. All right. Then he says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. I love this, right? Again, I said this chapter is all about love, and it is, because look what he wants you to do. So you're out there, you're harvesting, leave some stuff for the poor, right? Don't make them have to come to you for a handout, but leave it there so that they can go maintain their dignity and actually harvest what is left over, right? So if you're going along and you drop something, just leave it. Somebody will get that, right? That's what he's saying. Now, how do we translate this into our modern day? Because we don't nobody goes out into the fields to harvest things like that, right? We have these gigantic combines that are 45 feet across, and they can harvest like a crazy amount in one day. And they're really thorough, right? Well, so we'd have to then translate this. We have to put this into our modern day and say, okay, we don't have that kind of system, but we can then, maybe at the farm they can make something. But you know what? I'm not a farmer, so I shouldn't necessarily put that on them. So how can I do that? Well, this is where we can donate to food banks, whether it's actual food or we can donate money to a food bank. We can give, to those kinds of organizations so that people can still maintain their dignity and they can come and they can get food. They're not having to go and ask for money on the side of the street, but there's now a place for them to acquire food. Similar, not quite the same, right? They're not harvesting it themselves, but still they're able to go and kind of do their shopping for free, if you will. So food banks are a wonderful way for us to do that in the modern day. All right, he says, you shall not glean your vineyard. Nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. This is a big deal to God. He wants us to take care of the stranger and take care of the poor. This is really on his heart, right? And I love that because God's not just giving us this big list of do's and don'ts. You got to do all this stuff or I don't care for you. He's like, look, I care for people. And I want you to care for people. And if you say you love me, then do this, right? If you love me, then take care of your fellow brother and your fellow sister so that they will have something to eat. And here's a real obvious one. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. Lies are interesting because there's no particular penalty for lying. But when a community continues in lying, it eventually will fall apart because it cannot sustain the false narratives that are being put out there, and eventually things are just going to collapse, right? So that's why it's so important that we tell the truth. Truth is absolutely important. All right, and you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Well, that's a big deal, right? All right, well, why is that such a big deal? Well, if you claim to know God, you claim to serve and follow God, and then you don't do the things that God would require of you, and you're making God look bad. So you're really, in a sense, slandering God when you don't wear his name well, essentially. And now I understand that, I don't say God. Okay, I don't have that in my vocabulary. It's not something that I'm using. But to be fair, I don't think that is the actual taking the Lord's name in vain. All right. Again, I don't recommend we say that, but really, you can profane the name of the Lord without using God as a curse word or whatever, or an exclamation or something like that. Right. It's when we put the fish sticker on the back of our car and then we drive like, somebody who's crazy, or we have the little fish on our business cards, but then we don't act in a way we don't have any integrity. Or maybe we don't put a fish anywhere, but maybe people know that we are a follower of the Most High, and yet we're not acting that way, right? So that is taking the Lord's name in vain, and we don't want to do that. I think for good reasons. I think we all got that. You shall not cheat your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of him who is hired shall not remain with you all night until morning. I wish we spent far more time on this chapter in many of our Christian churches, because I think we would improve the way we're treating each other. This is what it looks like to love one another. When James says that we are to fulfill the royal law of love, this is it. Chapter 19 is that passage. And we're going to see in a little bit where it says that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? So all of these things, the whole golden rule and all this stuff, it's centered in this chapter, among others, of course, but this is a really big one. And this is where we get that actual phrase. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shall fear your God. I am the Lord. I really appreciate that in America, we try. I don't think we have a perfect record, but I think by and large, we do things that are helpful for blind and deaf people. I maybe can't speak as much to deaf people because I'm not as much exposed to that, but I know we do a fair amount for the blind. We have Braille all over the place, and we're trying to help them. We have a lot of guardrails, and here in America, we tend to sometimes go a little overboard on some things, right? But it's really good because God is saying, look, I want you to take care of these people and don't put a stumbling block in front of them. Why? Because it's not loving your neighbor. If you really want to be a Christian and you want to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, then here's this is a great list of suggestions of how you can do that. In fact, they're more than suggestions. These are, the commandments, right? But we'll call them suggestions for now because those seem to go down a little better. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. This is a super important one because sometimes that poor person can come to you and they give you this really sad story, and there's that big bad rich person, and you're like, oh, the rich person must be wrong. But what God is saying is, like, don't give special preference to the poor, nor special preference to the rich. You need to weigh the facts, and regardless of who's rich and who's poor and who has a sadder story, don't let those kinds of things sway you in your judgment. Now, you and I probably are not judges, right? So we may not have to consider that, but we are kind of judges because we're always in this world and we're having to assess and weigh and consider, right? And sometimes maybe it's on a social issue and we say, oh, the poor people, right? It's just so unfair that they have this, that, and the other. And those rich people, they're also bad. Maybe that's true, but maybe it's not. Maybe we're jumping the gun and we're not listening to all the facts on a certain topic. So God is telling us, be careful, right? Don't just assume because one group or one person is poor that they automatically are right in the situation. Be very careful. Then he says, you shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. This word right here is such a huge one, Rachil, right? This is found in Ezekiel 28, where, let's just go there. It's such an amazing passage. All right, so Ezekiel 28. Again, I talk about this a lot in Corrupting Image Volume 2, talking here about the king of Tyre, which was Melech Karat or Melkart, right? And Melech Karat was the king of the city, which was an epithet for Satan, right? I won't go into all the details, right? But look what he got in trouble for. It says, by the abundance of your trading, right? There's an English, but in Hebrew, rechulatcha. It's the same root, right? And the root here is, it's rooted in this word of to slander, to go about. Now, they translate it as trading. I think that is not the optimal translation, the optimal way to translate this word. Because it's the same as Rachil, which is a slanderer. I really think by the abundance of your slandering, you became filled with violence within. I think it makes way more sense. Again, I make the case for that in Corrupting Image Volume 2. So if you want to check that out, you can get the book. But this makes more sense in my opinion. So what did Satan do? And did God give him a chance to kind of get things right? By the abundance of your slandering, you became filled with violence and you sinned. Therefore, I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. All right. So he had an abundance of slandering, not just a one-off, but like many times over, he was slandering. Who was he slandering? Well, presumably God. Who else would he slander? And, when he came to Adam and Eve, what was he doing? Did God really say? Did God really say? That is slander. Oh, that's slander 101 right there. And yeah, sadly, Satan's a master of this, right? He can just put a little bit of a innuendo in there. He can put a little bit of a doubt. Did God really say that? And now you're wondering, I don't know. Well, did he? I thought he did. And these little doubts start to creep in. And again, he's just planting that seed of doubt until people are wondering and questioning the good character of God. And that's the same thing here. All right. So he says, you shall not go about as a slanderer or a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. What's the correlation between those? Well, when you start to cast doubt about the character of your neighbor, you really are, well, you're slandering him, but you are bringing his life, or his, maybe not his physical life, but it could be his livelihood. It could be his, his good reputation. You're calling that into question, and that can have all kinds of implications downstream, right? So that's a big no. Don't do that. And God is telling you, don't do that. And then he goes on, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not sin because of him. Notice here that your brother and your neighbor are the same. Isn't that interesting? So when Jesus was asking, hey, who's my, or the teacher, or the whatever, the lawyer, well, who's my neighbor, right? It's really, who's my brother, right? So this is important when we get down to you shall love your neighbor, or you should love your brother. They're really interchangeable here, because they both have the same idea. Your neighbor should be your brother, not your physical brother, but your brother that lives close to you, and you should treat him like a brother, maybe better than a brother. So don't hate him in your heart. If you got something against him, you need to get that off your chest and go speak to this person. Doesn't mean you got to chew him out and give him, a piece of your mind. That's not what it is. Rather than becoming bitter and holding on to resentment because something or else happened, you should go and talk to that person. And I'll tell you, I think so many illnesses could be cured if we would stop holding on to bitterness. Oh, because bitterness is going to dry up our bones, right? It's gonna give us all kinds of illness, things from cancer to headaches to schizophrenia, to all kinds of things can be caused by bitterness, because we're holding on. And like, well, I'm never going to forgive that person for what he did. And I become the one that suffers, not the guy that did whatever. And oftentimes when we actually go and speak to that person, it's usually a misunderstanding. Or, you could just go talk and say, what, hey, that offended me. You're like, oh man, I'm so sorry. Right. But because we don't usually do that, and we're just going to hold on to this, then we get to have that root of bitterness in our heart. And I mean, this can happen. You could be walking with the Lord for a long time, but you have that root of bitterness, and it gets really, really ugly. Right. And then what happens is it takes us back up to the previous one, which is about being a talebearer or a slanderer. Because you're now bitter towards somebody, you're going to start whispering. Did you hear about so-and-so? Yeah, well, I shouldn't say anything, but you know what? Here's what he did. And I'll tell you, a place where this happens all the time, Facebook. Yeah, right. That is slander city. And I've seen so many Christians do this. Look, I'm not saying I've never been guilty, but I've really tried to catch myself. And that's why I spend a lot less time on Facebook, because, well, you just tend to get into this stuff, and you start thinking, well, it's okay for me to slander so-and-so. And here's the thing. You may not be slandering your neighbor. You might be slandering a teacher that you don't like. All right. Just think of like the top 10 most famous teachers, Christian, whatever, pastors or teachers online or on TV. You're like, well, it's okay for me to slander them because they're different. No, they're not. They're people too. And you and I may not know all of their motives. Can we look at their fruit sometimes? Okay, sure. But we should be very careful that we don't slander them because we think we know the truth. Because you know what? When people do that about me or about you, and they think they know the whole story, but they're like, but if they just knew all the facts, they would understand, right? And that's what we do to others. And somehow we justify it. And God is really not into that. He hates that. In fact, in the Proverbs, it talks about says there are 7 things, yea, or there's 6 things, yea, 7 that the Lord hates. What's the first one? Pride, right? And then it talks about hands that are, shed blood. And also, it doesn't say talebearer, but it talks about, one who goes about sowing seeds of discord among his brethren. It's basically the same idea, right? God hates those things. You know what he calls them? An abomination. Yeah, an abomination. That's the same word that he uses when he talks about homosexuality being an abomination, right? So yes, that is an abomination, but so is pride. And so is slander. That's an abomination. But we don't talk about that one. We just talk about this other one because it's really obvious. That's an obvious sin that God hates. And sure, he does. But he also hates this stuff, right? He doesn't want you to do that. Why? Because he's holy, so we are to be holy. That's what God is telling us. So don't hate your brother because it can lead to bitterness and that can lead to slander. Do not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There it is, right? Don't bear a grudge. All these things, what is God trying to tell you? Love your neighbor. That's what this whole chapter is about. And where is it? It's in the middle of the Torah. That shouldn't be. That should be in the New Testament. Well, it's because they're not different. They're one and the same. The message is the same. It did not change from Old Testament to New Testament, right? It's all about loving God and loving your neighbor, period. That's it. Everything else is commentary on those two big ideas. And what does it mean to love your neighbor? What does it look like? Well, God's telling you. Don't be bitter toward him. Don't slander him. Don't cheat him. Don't steal from him. All these different things is a way to love your neighbor. That's what he's trying to get at. So he says, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind, nor you shall not sow your field with mixed seed, nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you. Now, I get this question a lot. Well, are we allowed to wear, mixed fabrics? Yes, you are. But we're not allowed to wear linen and wool together. That's the issue. Linen and wool are a no-no. You're not to put those together. Now, there have been different suggestions. It could be that linen and wool are at different frequencies and they're going to do weird things. It's also interesting that when you look under the microscope at linen, it's got like these little barbs like saws or teeth, right? And you put that together with wool and it's going to cut it, right? So there's definitely a practical thing that's not going to work either, all right? So then he goes on. Whoever lies carnally with a woman who is betrothed to a man as a concubine and who has not at all been redeemed nor given her freedom, for this there shall be scourging, but they shall not be put to death because she was not free. All right. So again, if she's somebody else's promise to her or she's promised to him, leave her alone, right? Just stay away. Okay. And he shall bring his trespass offering to the Lord to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, a ram as a trespass offering. The priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering before the Lord for his sin which he has committed, and the sin which he has committed shall be forgiven him. When you come into the land and have planted all kinds of trees for food, then you shall count their fruit as uncircumcised. 3 years it shall be as uncircumcised to you. It shall not be eaten. Now, I am not a garden guy, so I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know a little bit. And I know that it's just good to let the tree get settled, right? I planted a peach tree in our backyard, and I just didn't eat the fruit for the first several years, right? Because I wanted it to just take, and now it's thriving, right? It's doing really, really well, and that probably has something to do with cross pollination with other peach trees in the areas. It's letting the roots get deep down. It's also letting those peaches that come out, because they do come out, but then letting those fall to the ground, and then guess what? They could create more peach trees, right? So you'll have an abundance if you'll follow God's laws. And it's good for the earth as well, right? So if you're into earth and Earth Day, okay, fine. Do what God said, and the earth will get a whole lot happier, right? If we would just follow what he tells us to do. But in the 4th year, so this could be 3rd and a half year, right? And remember that Jesus told a parable about a man who had a fig tree, and for 3 years he found nothing on it. And then in the 4th year, he says, leave it alone for 1 more year. And if nothing this year, then we'll cut it down. All right. So in the 4th year, all its fruit shall be holy, a praise to the Lord. And in the 5th year, you may eat its fruit, that it may yield to you its increase. I am the Lord your God. You shall not eat anything with the blood, nor shall you practice divination or soothsaying. All right. So God is against blood. He's still against blood in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. He never says, oh yeah, it's okay to eat blood now. And yet I tell you, I had this conversation with some pastors some years ago about people that I heard people were eating something called blood pudding. And I was grossed out by this. I'm like, oh, that's nasty. All right. And I'm just like, I don't know why anybody would do that. And besides, we're not even supposed to do that. And this pastor looked at me with a straight face. He's like, we are allowed to eat anything. right? I'm like, but it says right there in the book of Acts. He says that was a transitional book. And I'm like, I don't think so. But, we didn't get too far on that conversation. Well, he says, don't eat blood. He's still serious about it. Don't eat blood. So blood pudding is out. I'm sorry, guys. You can't have that. Besides, it's nasty. But don't do that because it's not good for you. And there's energy related to it. The life is in the blood. This is why you have people in, whether it's Satanism or let's call them primitive societies that will drink the blood of their enemies or something like that. Why? Yeah, there's energy in that. And they're trying to imbibe that energy into themselves. And God's like, don't do that. And I think this is where Satan and his demons or his fallen angels, that they actually derive energy from that blood as well. And so we are not to do that. God has given it to us as a way for a covering, a kafar, right? It can be an atonement, but we're not to drink it, right? So it can be something to cover us, but not to drink. All right, you shall not shave around the sides of your head, nor shall you disfigure the edges of your beard. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am the Lord. All right, so if you notice, I actually have a clean face, right? Because I shave. You may say, well, you're not supposed to shave, right? Now, this is, of course, how a lot of rabbis interpret this. Not all of them, to be fair, but a lot of them, especially the ultra-Orthodox that you've probably seen in Brooklyn or Mea Shearim in Israel, right? They got the big, long beards, and that's fine. I have no issues with that, okay? That's great if they want to do that. But the idea here that the way many people interpret this is that you must do this. You're not allowed to shave, but you're not allowed to disfigure the edges of your beard, right? Or shave the sides of your head. That's why a lot of them have the peyot, right? So what I see here, the way I'm understanding this, is that you're not allowed to do this on behalf of the dead. So I want to go to the parallel passage, which we are going to find in right here, I think it is. All right, they shall not make any bald place on their heads, nor shall they shave the edges of their beards, nor shall they make any cuttings in their flesh. They shall be holy. So this is talking about what the priests are supposed to do. All right, so here we go, Deuteronomy 14. So you are the children of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves nor shave the front of your head for the dead. All right, so there it is, for the dead. You're not supposed to do this for the dead. So, your Aunt Susie dies and you're mourning, you're so sad. So you're going to shave off your beard for her sake. God says, don't do that. Don't do that. So again, it's not a prohibition against shaving. It's a prohibition against shaving for the specific purpose of doing it for the dead. And you could potentially interpret this as understanding that you would do this for the cult of the dead. Okay. Whether this is Molech or any of those other false gods, and that you're going to do this as part of some death ritual, like burning babies kind of ritual, that kind of stuff. Okay. So that's what he's getting at here, at least in my opinion. Again, I respect the ones that have long beards and they think that God's telling them to do that. Okay. I see it very differently, but that's fine. We don't have to see eye to eye on that necessarily. So that's how I understand them. So you're not supposed to do that for the dead. And it says, nor tattoo any marks on you. I also understand that in relationship with the dead. Okay, so you're not supposed to get a tattoo if it's for the dead. Okay, now I would suggest that tattoos are not such a cool thing, and so I would urge people not to get a tattoo. However, in my understanding, I don't think it's a sin to get a tattoo, as long as you're not doing it for the purpose of the dead. But think about this. Tattoos are kind of permanent, all right? And you might be excited about it today, but in 10 years or 20, you might not be that excited about it. And you're like, why did I do that? So I think it's a better idea not to get the tattoos, but hey. All right. Do not prostitute your daughter to cause her to be a harlot, lest the land fall into harlotry and the land become full of wickedness. All right. Now, this is from a father or parents to their daughter, right? So this is talking about that she's not to have any part of any cultic rituals. All right. So in the ancient world, they would have a temple prostitute. Remember Jacob right? Not Jacob, but Judah. So Judah, he goes and he lays with Tamar, right? But he thinks that she is a kedusha. He thinks that she is a temple prostitute. That's the word he uses. Kedusha actually means holy. It means someone who's set apart. Set apart for what? For the temple, for this temple prostitution. And then the people of that area say, well, we don't know. There's no temple prostitute here. And they use both words. They use the word zonah and they use the word kedusha because they both mean the same thing. All right. So Israel was to have no part in taking their daughters and then offering them to some false god, and then all the stuff that went on there. So that bad. Okay, don't do that. Why? The land will become full of wickedness. Seems pretty self-evident, but I don't know. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. So this is twice he's told us to keep his Sabbath. I think God is kind of into the Sabbath and his Sabbaths, right? All these special days. Give no regard to mediums and familiar spirits. Do not seek after them to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. It's interesting. God doesn't say they're a bunch of nonsense. Not at all. In fact, I think mediums and familiar spirits have power. They may have the ability. I don't think they can speak to the dead per se. That was a little hard to say, but they can definitely speak to unclean spirits. They can speak to fallen angels. So God doesn't seem to contest that. He's just like, just don't do it. Okay. Yeah, they can do it. They have certain powers and they're real, but don't go there. I have all the answers you need. Come to me if you've got questions. Don't go to them. And of course, King Saul blew it big time. He didn't seek out the Lord as he should have, but he went to a necromancer, and I actually think that she brought up Samuel. I'm quite convinced that she actually brought up Samuel, but that's neither here nor there. God says, don't do it. I love this one. You shall rise before the gray-headed and honor the presence of an old man and fear the Lord your God. I am the Lord, right? So when you see somebody coming, gray-headed person, old person, you're to honor them. Sadly, in our society, old people have become dead weight. We don't want them. Sometimes we make fun of them. And it's something that should never happen. Again, this whole chapter is about love. This is how you love people very, very, very practically. These are ways to love other people. And if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. Wow. Right? Okay. How many wars have been started because of people who are not like us? They're not one of us. We don't like them. They should get out of here. I mean, this was rampant in the early 1900s. This was rampant here in America. I mean, big time rampant, right? We had a lot of refugees coming in, from like 1900 to 1910, somewhere in there. And then this backlash started where people are like, we don't like this. We don't like all these people that aren't like us coming in, right? Even though they had the same color skin, right? It wasn't that one was black and one was white. No, they're all white, but they're not our kind of people. And they come with these funny accents and we don't like them. Now, of course, those people who are saying those things, their very grandparents probably came here a generation earlier, but we don't want to talk about that, right? And so now you have people coming in and they're different somehow. They're not going to fit in. We don't want them. But God says you cannot mistreat him. And again, this was incredibly rampant in the early 1900s, not just here in America, but in Europe as well. I don't need to remind you of what happened in the Holocaust. And that was all because we have some strangers living among us that aren't like us and we don't like them. We're going to blame everything on the Jews. That was horrific and tragic. But it was also happening to lesser degrees when the Ottoman Empire was falling apart. You had Greeks living in Turkey and Turks living in Greece. And this wave of nationalism swept through Europe at that time. And the Greeks said, we don't want these Turks living here. They need to go back to Turkey. And the Turks said, we don't want these Greeks living here. They need to go back to Greece. And so they kicked them out. But the problem was when either of those groups went back to their homeland, so to speak, it wasn't their homeland. Because the Turks living in Greece said, but we're Greek. We're one of you. But they said, nope, no, you're not.
And so they had to go back. But then the Turks didn't want them because they're like, you're not one of us, you're a Greek. And so they had nowhere to go. And so it was a complete mishandling of this verse right here. If a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Now, again, I know there's all kinds of scenarios, and we can say, well, this has been going on. Yeah, it's been terrible for a long time in many, many places, not just here, not just Europe, but in many countries. But again, if we lived according to this stuff, our life and our world would be so different because we would treat each other with dignity and with equity. You shall do no injustice in judgment, in measurement of length, weight, or volume. You shall have honest scales, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe my statutes and all my judgments and perform them. I am the Lord. Right? So again, God really cares. Why would he care about honest scales and weights? Because he wants you to be an honest business person, right? Scales and weights and things of volume and whatnot, these are all about business transactions, right? I'm going to sell you a bushel of wheat, but if I have what would be the equivalent in weight of that, and I'm cheating on this, then I'm not giving you the real value. I say I'm giving you X amount, but I'm giving you less than X because I'm using dishonest scales and weights, right? And of course, the book of Proverbs talks about this, that this is a thing that God hates because you're being dishonest. You're cheating. That's what it is. It's cheating. God does not want us to cheat. He wants us to be fair and honest and true. Now, if you want to raise your prices, raise your prices. But be honest about raising your prices. Don't try to deceive people when it comes to the prices and price gouging. Therefore, you shall observe all my statutes and my judgments and perform them. I'm the Lord. Now, let's go back to Genesis chapter 26, verse 5. I love this. What did Abraham do? Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. All right, so he listened to Shema Avraham, Bekoli, he listened to my voice. Vayishmor mishmarti, right? He kept my charge, mitzvotai, chukotai, vetorotai. So he kept my charge, he kept my commandments, he kept my ordinances or statutes, and he kept my Torahs or my instructions. Abraham did all those things, but how could he possibly do this if God had not yet given the Torah? Well, there you go. Maybe, just maybe, when Abraham and God were hanging out, maybe God was telling Abraham some of these things. And possibly these things have been passed down since, I don't know, Adam. It could be, right? So these were not something that were new when God spoke them at Mount Sinai and later. They were already in existence. They were already understood, and they were practiced even by the father of the faith, Abraham himself. All right. That's a big deal. So we got to keep that in mind when we're looking at these and saying, oh, these are so outdated. They have nothing to do for me. All right. Now it goes on. This one's also about love, not quite as boldly as 19, but it's also important because God wants us to do right. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, again, you shall say to the children of Israel, whoever of the children of Israel or of the strangers who dwell in land in Israel, who gives any of his descendants to Molech, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. I will set my face against that man and will cut him off from his people because he's given some of his descendants to Molech to defile my sanctuary and profane my holy name. Now, Molech is a terrible god. He's actually the god of death. All right, the god of death. So when it talks about you shall not, shave your face or get a tattoo for the dead, it very well could be talking about in honor to Molech, not just, Aunt Susie died, but you're doing this in honor of Molech. That very well could be what this is talking about. Now, Molech had many names. One of them was Enlil. All right, and as I talked about before, Enlil and Elilim, Elil, right? That's all talking about Satan, right? So yeah, it wasn't pretty. This was really terrible and nasty stuff. So God says he's going to set his face against this person. Now, what would they do? Well, they would take their child, their little baby, and they would burn him to Molech alive. This was a horrendous, heinous crime, and God hated it. And it was one of the major reasons that God said, all right, that's it, Jerusalem, it's over, it's done. In fact, we see this in Jeremiah 7:31. He says, and they have built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, which is Gehenna, right? To burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my heart. Oh, this was so terrible. And you know who really brought this into Israel big time? King Solomon. Not a very good thing. So God's like, this didn't even come into my heart that you would do such a terrible thing. Why? Because it's about love. Burning your baby is not loving, not in the least. All right, so you gotta get rid of this guy. You gotta put him to death because he's done something so terrible. And it says, and if the people of the land should in any way hide their eyes from the man when he gives some of his descendants to Molech, and they do not kill him. Remember, they've got to protect here the little baby. If they're not willing to get rid of this guy, well, that means they're not complicit. He says, then I will set my face against the man and against his family, and I will cut him off from his people. And all who prostitute themselves with him to commit harlotry with Molech. And we see this word harlotry. Why harlotry? This whole idea of prostitution, because they're supposed to be married to God, and yet they're now worshiping Molech. Supposed to be married to God and worshiping and serving him, but now they're worshiping and serving somebody else. That is a form of adultery or prostitution. God uses both of them. And the person who turns to mediums of familiar spirits to prostitute himself with them, I will set my face against that person and cut him off from his people. Right? So we saw don't do this in chapter 19, and here are the results if you do. Okay, here are the consequences if you do that. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am the Lord your God, and you shall keep my statutes and perform them. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. For everyone who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father or his mother, his blood shall be upon him. Right? So again, chapter 19, honor your father and mother. What happens if you don't? Well, then you're to be put to death, and it's your blood upon yourself. You brought this upon yourself. Again, don't go after another man's wife. The man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. So here's the consequence of your actions. You know what? There's always a consequence to your actions. Okay. So don't go against what God said to do. The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall be put to death. Their blood should be upon them. Paul talks about this, right? He's like, hey, you Corinthians, what are you guys doing? There's stuff that even the pagans aren't doing. You know, that a man has his father's wife. He's like, ugh, right? So Paul had been teaching them Torah, and they should have known that you don't do that because it's clearly in Moses or in the Torah where you're not supposed to do this, and yet they're doing something pretty bad. If a man lies with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall surely be put to death. They have committed perversion. Their blood should be upon them. If a man lies with a male as he lies with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. You know, it seems like these wouldn't need any commentary, right? It seems like they should be clear, but they're not, right? And this really seems to be kind of the last rebellion against God, right? God made man for women, women for men, but man's like, you know what? Forget it. I'm going to go after another man. And it's just it's unnatural. It's wrong. And again, as I explained before, that's an abomination. And oftentimes in the church, we like to throw stones at that sin. And yeah, it's wrong. But God is also against pride and sowing seeds of discord, etc. Right? And we often forget those things because those are also called an abomination. So I'm just saying we need to be a little more circumspect about how we live our lives and what sins we're going to look at. We tend to just look at this sin over here because it's wrong, and it is. but we forget about the sins that we're doing. So, let's just keep that in mind. All right. And if a man lies with a male, I read that. So if he marries a woman and her mother, it's wickedness, and they should be burned with fire, both he and they, that there may be no wickedness among you. So they probably would stone them first, just like they did with Achan in the book of Joshua, right? They burned him with fire, but first they stoned him. So that's probably the same case. They did not burn them alive, which I think is really good. All right. If a man mates with an animal, he shall surely be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. Yeah, that seems like a good idea. I won't go. I'm not going to say anymore. If a woman approaches any animal, mates with it, you shall kill the woman and the animal. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. It seems really self-evident. If a man takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it's a wicked thing, and they shall be cut off from the sight of the people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness. He shall bear his guilt. Again, so you cannot marry that close of a kin, all right? Because biologically, genetically, things start to happen, right? So don't do that. If a man lies with a woman during her sickness and uncovers her nakedness, he has exposed her flow, and she has uncovered the flow of her blood. Both of them should be cut off from their people. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, nor of your father's sister, for that would uncover his near of kin. They shall bear their guilt. Yeah, all kinds of, it should be really obvious stuff, right? If a man lies with his uncle's wife, he has uncovered his uncle's nakedness. They shall bear their sin. They shall die childless. If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He has uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. You shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments and perform them, that the land where I am bringing you to dwell may not vomit you out. Well, guess what happened? It did vomit them out, right? It did. Why? Because, well, they were doing the things God said not to do, these among them. And you shall not walk in the statutes of the nations which I am casting out before you, for they commit all these things, and therefore I abhor them. But I've said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, who has separated you from the peoples. You shall therefore distinguish between clean animals and unclean, between unclean birds and clean, and you shall not make yourselves abominable by beast or by bird or by any kind of living thing that creeps on the ground, which I have separated from you as unclean. And you shall be holy to me, for I am the Lord. I am the Lord, am holy, and I've separated you from the peoples that you should be mine. And a man or woman who is a medium or who has familiar spirits shall be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them, right? So God's saying, look, you guys are different. You're mine. You're to act differently. So yeah, the nations eat unclean animals. Well, okay, that's them. But don't you do it, right? And again, if we've been brought into the commonwealth of Israel, Ephesians chapter 2, then we're part of this. This applies to us. And that is why I don't eat unclean animals or unclean birds. It's not because I'm trying to be Jewish. It's because I'm part of this thing called the Commonwealth of Israel. And if it was good enough for them, guess what? It's certainly good enough for me. Right? God's values haven't changed. All these things seem incredibly obvious to me that we're not supposed to do this. And I think 100 out of 100 Christians, well, maybe 95 out of 100 Christians would agree that we're not supposed to do those kind of sexual unions on this list. Some of them would maybe disagree with that, but most Christians, I think, would probably agree with that. But then you get to this part about, well, don't eat unclean things. Well, like, well, that's different. That was changed. No, it wasn't. It wasn't changed. It remains the same. And guess what? It's for your good. God loves you. He loves me. He wants us to live in a way that's going to be beneficial to us and to our fellow man, right? So again, these two chapters were all about love, how I can love God and I can love my fellow man. He gave us a bunch of incredible examples of what that looks like in everyday practical living. So that's fantastic. Oh, well, thank you guys. I can see we have a couple of questions. Let me just get to that, and then we'll call it a night. When you guys do Prophecy Roundtable again, would you be able to cover the topic from last week if it wasn't canceled? Yes, we're going to talk about that tomorrow. Okay, so I hope you guys can join us tomorrow night. We'll be talking about the topic that we had planned from the previous week, so it will be a lot of fun. So definitely do join us. That is tomorrow night at 6 Mountain, which is 8 Eastern, right? So please do join us for that. Just want to see if I have any more questions. Here's another one. Okay. This is Hawkeye. Do you see a connection between the prohibition for cutting hair, beard to number 6, the Nazarite vow? I don't think so. So the Nazarite vow, they had to, of course, shave their beard and they had to shave their head. Well, they didn't do that while they were under the vow, right? When they were done with the vow, then they would shave. I don't think there's a connection. So obviously, thank you for pointing that out, because the Nazarite vow shows that it's okay under certain circumstances to actually shave your face and your hair, right? The prohibition is don't do it on behalf of the dead, which is quite possibly a reference to Molech and all of that cult of the dead kind of stuff. Very good. All right. Well, thank you guys. I encourage you to get the app, the Way Congregation app. You're going to love it. It's got a lot of great stuff on there. If you want to give through that, you're welcome to do that. You can also go to my patreon.com page, patreon.com/Doug Hamp, and you can give as little as $2 to whatever you want every month. Appreciate it. It helps everything to keep flowing. All right. God bless you. Have a good night. Take care.